need to get the advice, because imagine if you went through all of that cost of setting it up, all of the effort of finding and purchasing the property, realising that this is going to form part of your sort of retirement vision that you've got in your mind, then all of a sudden it's like, no, that's not going to work.
Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics such as investing, cash flow, budgeting, saving, passive income, debt management, and much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host.
Andrew, Bills, here we are back in the recording studio.
Andrew, we are again back in the recording studio, coming over the airwaves to our listeners and our viewers, bringing a whole heap of value.
Airwaves, you're showing your age, Billy.
I digress a bit. My father-in-law calls the radio the wireless. The wireless.
I've never heard that one before. That's a new one.
Hey, we're coming over the wireless listeners.
Although wireless is that, I don't know, I'd say that'd be more relevant these days. I mean, wireless is, that's a thing, but airwaves, I don't think I've heard airwaves for a long while.
There you go. Maybe because when you look at it, it's, I don't know.
We digress.
Yes. Andrew, what are we talking to everybody about today?
Yeah, so today we're talking a little bit about a topic that we get asked about very frequently, and that's using your superannuation to purchase property. How do you do it? You know, what needs to be done in order to do it? And what are some of the considerations that you need to make?
Exciting topic. Yeah, and very timely as well too, which is great. So let's kick off and let's get into it. I mean, look, the SMSF self-managed super fund, we're going to use that acronym non-stop today. Essentially, to get one thing sort of straight right across the board is, even though it is self-managed, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a bit more detail in a sec, but the superannuation legislation still remains the same.
Yep.
So the crux of that environment is designed to save for your future retirement benefit, your future retirement income. So all of the rules in terms of being able to put money in, being able to access it and take money out, and the things that you can do stay the same. It's just that with self-managed, it opens up a particular aspect. In this instance, we're talking about the ability to purchase property in there, but all of the rules still stay the same.
Yeah. So I think the portion of it that sometimes can be understated but shouldn't be understated is it's exactly as it sounds. So it's a self-managed super fund. So you can theoretically draw money out, put money in. You're not governed by any rules like you would with a regular superannuation fund, in that the superannuation trustee is going to make sure that you're not breaching contribution limits and that you're not drawing money out or anything like that. A self-managed super fund, you'll have access to absolutely everything. The only difference is that you'll get audited every year. And so you need to manage it on your own. You need to manage the tax obligations on your own. I mean, obviously with the help of an accountant. You need to manage the contribution limits, withdrawals, all of that stuff on your own, even though it's essentially just going to be a bank account for you.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing as well too. Just talking about the risks. The risk of doing something wrong, you are the trustee, so you're managing it yourself. You need to make sure that you're confident enough that you've got the knowledge, the support, the advisory team in place that you don't breach any of those rules, because the penalties are quite significant. So even though it gives you a greater amount of flexibility, which we'll talk about in a sec, we'll talk about the opportunity, we can't understate the risk associated with it as well too, because you really need to know what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And in addition to that, there's also the costs that are also involved. So when you're setting up a self-managed super fund, I mean, there's usually a few parties that are involved in that transaction. There's some advice from a financial advisor to make sure that you've got advice on setting it up. There's an accountant that also needs to establish it. And if there's borrowings, then there's also some costs associated with the lending, potentially legal fees in looking at the contract. So you do need to consider the establishment costs as well as also the everyday running costs when you're looking at whether this is appropriate or not appropriate for you as well, because it can get quite expensive.
Andrew, let's pivot into the property aspect of it. So what's different with a self-managed super fund versus all of the other superannuation funds is with a self-managed superannuation fund, it gives you the ability to purchase direct property inside your self-managed super fund.
Correct.
With self-managed, there's more investment opportunities available with it. We're not going to talk about those today. We're purely going to focus on property. But for the sake of, I guess, this conversation, self-managed super fund, being able to buy property within that.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's, for the most people, the reason why they go down a self-managed super fund. Now, there are some outliers and there are some, slightly different situations and people that will do things for different reasons. But the vast majority of people will do it to be able to purchase a property. When you do talk about property and when you do talk about a self-managed super fund, there are some things that you do need to be aware of, because you don't have as much flexibility to purchase property like you do when you purchase a property under your own personal name. So it has to be for investment purposes. There can be no owner-occupied benefit. So you can't, live in a room. You can't use any of it for personal use. Same story goes, even if it's, for argument's sake, which is sometimes a common one that we get, a holiday house. So I have a holiday house. It's an investment property. I'm Airbnb-ing it out. But every now and again, I want to go live in the property. You can't. Even if you pay rent to your self-managed super fund, you can't live in the property.
Even if you go through Airbnb?
Even if you go through Airbnb, no matter what you do, you cannot use it for any personal use. There's only one exception, and that exception is for business real property.
Yeah.
So if you're self-employed, if you have your own business, your business is allowed to rent the property from the self-managed super fund, which is another very common strategy, but there can't be any other personal use because of the related party transaction rules.
Yeah. Yep. And I think when sort of self-managed super funds first came out, the rules were quite lax. The record keeping was quite lax. So people would buy an investment property in a beachside town and, I'm going there to do maintenance, so I'm claiming my airfares and I'm staying there for 5 nights while I'm painting and maintaining and upgrading the property and stuff. All of that has gone out the window now. But pivoting into the business real property one, it's a really common strategy for business owners who are in that position. If you operate from a premises, and that could be a warehouse, that could be an office space. If you're operating a business, you can rent as the tenant. Your business can be the tenant from the self-managed super fund. So in that instance, and the reason why it's so popular is because your business is spending the expense. So you're claiming that as an expense, as a deduction. And then on the other hand, you're receiving the income through your self-managed super fund. So your business is paying the expense and you're receiving the benefit of the income. All the while, you've got an asset that's growing alongside that.
So your business gets to claim an expense to basically pay yourself, which,
that's it.
Yeah, look, it can be very powerful in that regard. And it's, I dare say, a lot of the reasons that we would normally recommend this when we're recommending a self-managed super fund and purchasing property through it. A lot of it is the business real property side of things.
Andrew, one of the things, just pivoting back to the holiday house. So I turned 39 during the week.
Yeah. Yep, 39, forever 39.
So I buy a holiday house up in Queensland on the beach somewhere through my self-managed super fund.
Yep.
And then I retire in the future.
Yep.
I want to go and retire and live in that property.
You cannot. So one of the limitations to a self-managed super fund is there can be no related party transactions. So, yeah, a lot of people do think, I'm going to purchase my future retirement property. I'm going to, in essence, use the money that I have in super contributions to pay off that property, and then I'll sell it to myself once I'm retired, and all of a sudden I've got the ability to move in that property. That's not possible. And the reason that it's not possible is even if you sell the property from the self-managed super fund to yourself as the individual, you are not able to do so because of the related party rules. So even if it's at market rates, even if you pay stamp duty, even if you pay any potential capital gains tax, all of that stuff, it cannot be done. So you really need to make sure that if you're doing this, you know what the strategy is and that you are getting quality advice, because we did get that exact same scenario, which is why Billy's asking it a couple of weeks ago with a client who had already gone down that route of the strategy and already realized at the very end that, hey, what you're doing is actually not possible.
Which is interesting enough, because you need to get the advice. Because imagine if you went through all of that cost of setting it up, all of the effort of finding and purchasing the property, realizing that this is going to form part of your sort of retirement, vision that you've got in your mind, then all of a sudden it's like, no, that's not going to work. So yeah, no, completely agree. Andrew, one of the main benefits, obviously the property itself, but the ability to be able to leverage within a self-managed super fund. So you can, similar to how you'd buy property in, I guess, your own name, where you've got a deposit, and you'd go and borrow money from the bank for the rest of it. You've got the ability to do that within your self-managed super fund as well too. There are some tighter lending requirements that sit around that. So, you need to make sure that your super guarantee contribution is going in on a constant basis to help support any loan that you take out. Your loan to value ratio usually sits at 70% or below for most lenders as well too. But it's a really worthwhile consideration because it does give you the ability to leverage and be able to get a larger asset into your superannuation fund by borrowing money in order to enable a transaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And normally you can't borrow money in the superannuation environment. So a self-managed super fund with what's called a bare trust, which it operationally sits alongside it, it is the only environment that will allow for borrowing in the self-managed super funds or in the superannuation environment. So once you take into account the power of leveraging, the power of being able to not just use your own money, but use a portion of the bank's money to grow your wealth, it can be a very, very powerful strategy. That being said, as Billy mentioned, there's some limitations around the lending requirements, so it's not the same as what it is for yourself personally, but there's also some limitations around if there are borrowings in the superannuation environment, what you can do. So you can't use borrowings for construction, you can't use borrowings for development, and the borrowing costs are generally, depends on the environment, but 1% to 2% higher than what it is if you're borrowing money from the bank at personal rates.
Andrew, I just want to pivot a little bit, and one of the things that we talk to clients about is lack of diversification. So if you think that you take the money that you've got in superannuation, you convert that to cash to use it as a deposit, all of a sudden you've gone and purchased this property, you've borrowed some money, but essentially all of the assets that sit inside your self-managed super fund is just the property plus maybe a bank account with some cash. So there's a huge diversification problem when it comes to that, because all of your assets, all of your wealth, it's tied up in one asset. Yeah. So we see that as being a really big issue and a really big red flag to consider when you're in that position.
Yeah. And the other thing is, if that's, firstly, there's the risk associated with it. If something does happen to that particular property or to that particular asset and it doesn't grow at the rate as what you expected. But the other risk that's associated with that is if all of your money is tied up within the one property and all that you're getting in retirement phase is just the rental income of that property, it does mean that you're fairly limited. So, okay, let's say you're wanting to draw money out of your superannuation, you're wanting to, in essence, retire on your superannuation benefit, or the amount of money that you can draw out is limited to just the rental income that you're receiving. You don't have the ability to, sell a portion of the property. You don't have the ability to sell an aspect of the property. All you have the ability to do is retire on the income that you're receiving from that property, and that's it.
Yep. One of the benefits that we talk to people about when they are doing this calculation as well too, because if you think about purchasing a property today and then what it would be like by the time you retire in 2-3 decades, if you think about the growth associated with that, you take a property value worth X and so on and so forth, but think about this for a sec. From a capital gains tax perspective, when you sell the property, if you're in pension phase, so you buy it when you're in accumulation phase, if you sell it when you're in pension phase, and we almost need the drum roll machine here, Andrew, is that you're not going to pay capital gains tax when you sell that if you're in pension phase.
Exactly right. So it's a very worthwhile consideration for some people to potentially look at, all right, maybe you look at purchasing a property, maybe you utilize it for all of the capital growth, the leveraging and the benefits associated with that, and then have the intention to sell that property in pension phase, pay no capital gains tax when you sell that property, And now all of a sudden you can have your diversification, you can have your income coming from multiple sources without being reliant on just rental income and what you have coming in from a rental perspective, and reposition your assets to deliver an income when you ultimately need to start taking the income from it.
Yeah. So Andrew, outside of the diversification consideration, some of the things that we need to consider, you need the cash flow to be able to support the property and the borrowing itself. So that's going to be a requirement from the lender to make sure that you've got that adequately covered. I think along with that, you're also going to need to make sure that you've got some cash reserves as well too, just in case there's a timing issue in between when all of the income starts coming in versus when the repayments start going out. And that also ties into needing to make sure that you've got enough cash sitting in there to pay the ongoing expenses as well with the property.
Yeah, exactly right. So you need to make sure that, firstly, you can do it. So just because you can do it, the next question is, should you do it? So, okay, consider two scenarios, and it's not quite as simple as this because there's probably multiple different options within it. But what we would normally do for a client when we're looking at if a self-managed super fund is appropriate and if purchasing a property in that is appropriate, okay, here's scenario one, which is you purchase the property, maybe you need to put some additional money towards super and maybe, it's going to grow at this rate of return. What's the projected outcome at the end of it?
Yeah.
Versus you do exactly what you're doing now with, within the existing superannuation environment, you put that additional money that you would have otherwise put into there. So equalize the scenarios and what's the end position likely to get to. Then at least if there's a intangible reason that you decide to go down property because you're comfortable with it, you understand it or whatever it is, you can take that into consideration. But from a financial perspective, you're armed with the data and information to know, okay, this is financially what's likely to be the best option and this is why.
Yeah. And if all of that sounded sort of too confusing, I think the thing that we wrap a bow around with it is get advice.
Yeah.
Because it can be such a powerful tool in order to help you save for your retirement goals. But at the same time, there are some issues with it and it's easy to put a foot afoul and make a misstep when it comes to this and really, get yourself into some hot water as well. So from my end, I think it's a worthwhile strategy to consider. I think for business owners who are operating out of their own premises, it's definitely something, operating out of the premises, it's definitely something to consider because you can turn what you deem as an expense, being the rental income that you pay, into an asset on the other side, being the self-managed super fund, and ultimately getting some advice to see if it could be a consideration for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Bills, I think that ties a nice bow around it. So thanks again for another great episode.
Thank you.
Thanks to our viewers and our listeners for tuning in. If you got some value out of that one, like, subscribe, share, and we look forward to catching you on the next podcast.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.